Good morning and welcome to Columbia Law School. My name is Michael Gerard. I'm a professor of environmental law here and the director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. It's my pleasure to host this event, a joint event of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, of which I'm a member, and the American College of Construction Lawyers. I'll be back up in a minute, but first I wanted to call on John Curtin, the president of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, to make a couple of remarks.
Michael, thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to return to Columbia Law School, one of the great learning worlds and an extraordinary environmental program that we'll take advantage of today. This is the bringing together of two different colleges with different focus to put together a program looking at one of the more important issues facing us today when we look at both resilience and we look at sustainability in the context of something extraordinarily important to our future. The American College of Environmental Lawyers has over 250 environmental lawyers. It's a very select group. We only take about 20 a year. You cannot apply. You have to get nominated, selected. We have an exceptional pro bono program internationally and educational program as well. And it's really a pleasure for us to join so many of you, and we have members of our college in the audience, to be here, to participate, and to see whether or not the joining of two different colleges and the program that Michael Gerard and Leslie and others have put together can make a difference in our future. So thank you very much. I'll be here all day for all of you.
Thank you, John. And I'd now like to call on Jenny Fletcher, the immediate past president of the American College of Construction Lawyers.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this exciting program. Thanks so much to Michael and Leslie and Bob and others who have spent a lot of time putting together a fabulous program that I think has a lot of meaning and hopefully resiliency for all of us as we go forward in our paths to environmental and construction success. The American College of Construction Lawyers is very excited to be doing this joint program, and I hope it will be the first of many endeavors where we can collaborate with other colleges to bring meaning and hopefully good thoughts and education to people around the country and the world. So thank you again, and it's nice to be here. Everybody, I hope you'll enjoy the day.
So this first panel is on the subject of resilience and sustainability in design and construction. In the context of the built environment, resilience is the capacity to adapt to changing conditions and to maintain or regain functionality and vitality in the face of stress or disturbance. It's the capacity to bounce back after a disturbance or interruption. Resilient design is the intentional design of buildings, landscapes, communities, and regions in response to these vulnerabilities. In the environmental context, sustainability refers to the modes of construction, operation, and development that meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainable design and construction typically involve ways to reduce the consumption of energy, water, and materials, and the generation of pollution and waste. So in a sense, sustainability is about reducing impacts, and resilience is about coping with the impacts that occur. In this first panel on resilience and design, we'll be hearing from a climate scientist who will discuss the current projections for what we need to be resilient to. And then we'll hear from three people who are involved in actually designing and building resilient projects. The second panel will get into planning and legal issues. We'll hear from officials in two places that have been subjected to climate stresses and continue to be: Broward County, Florida, and New York City. And they'll tell us how those places are coping. Then we'll hear from a journalist who has been reporting on these issues to give his perspective. Then we'll hear from a lawyer who will discuss certain liability issues. After lunch, we'll have a panel discussing some of the issues in providing energy in buildings that's as efficient as possible and helps with the needed transition away from fossil fuels. And thus it will deal with both sustainability and resilience. The closing panel will bring many of these issues together and try to peer into the future. First, just a couple of logistical points. During the morning and afternoon coffee breaks, there'll be coffee outside just where you picked up breakfast. Lunch will be grab-and-go sandwiches and other things also that you'll get from the same place and that we'll eat here. The restrooms go out, and to the left, it's just across the hall right before the drinking fountain. You'll find the restrooms. Please turn off your cell phones. During the Q&A periods, in front of each of you is a microphone. So if you're called on, just push the button that will make your mic go live. So I'm going to introduce each speaker very briefly before he or she speaks. Paul Curtin, who was listed on the program, fell ill, and he's not able to be with us, but we have a terrific panel. Please hold your questions until the last speaker has spoken. Full bios are in the packets that you have. So just very briefly, our first speaker is Dr. Radley Horton, who's an associate research professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. His research focuses on climate extremes, tail risks, climate impacts, and adaptation. Radley?
So I can advance everything here. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mike, and all of you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I am going to cover a lot of material from the most recent National Climate Assessment version 4 special report, which was released last November. I won't have time to go into a lot of specific projections for individual places, but I encourage folks to go to this document to learn more sort of region by region about what we expect for, how the frequency of extreme heat days, incidences of coastal flooding and heavy rain are going to change by region. And more that type of information is even available sort of city by city, as many of you I'm sure know. But I'm actually going to talk at a little broader scale for a couple reasons. One, in the interest of time, I can't go into details about each specific place, but more generally, I want to push back a little bit against the notion of very specific projections, exact numbers for how many days per year we might get over, say, 100 degrees in the future. I simultaneously recognize how critical it is for decision-making, engineering decisions, for example, to have a precise number. We're always going to need that precise number. But I want to also make the point that even as our climate science advances, some of these uncertainties probably are not going to narrow much in the future. And we already know enough. We already know how the direction of change is going to move for things like sea level, higher temperatures. We're going to see a profound shift in the frequency of occurrence of many different types of extreme events, far more magnitude to those events. We can be certain of that, even as we can't provide that information about exactly how many additional flood events you might get in the year. But I think, the pushback is to find ways to embrace or accept some of those uncertainties, just as we accept other sources of uncertainty about economic growth projections, for example, when we do our long-term planning. And just, embracing with priority, obvious maybe more to you even than to me, that all of our decisions reflect a blend of where the climate science sits, but also our particular risk profile, for the decisions we're making as well. So these are really the key points that I'm going to make in the presentation. I'll talk a little bit in detail about just how profoundly small shifts in average conditions, the 1 degree of warming that we've already had, the foot or less of sea level rise that we've had in the last century, they've already profoundly shifted the frequency of many different types of extreme events that we care about and that really impact our infrastructure. The second point a bit less quantitative, but as important, really reflects a new focus that was in the climate science special report that I referred to for the first time. It's stepping back a little bit from relying on climate models to give us a most likely sort of central range of outcomes and saying, we're more and more concerned about what we call surprises, tipping points and feedbacks, ways that our climate models may actually be underestimating some of the worst case scenarios, not just in terms of what might happen to the climate, but societal impacts. So even as we move forward with quantitative projections, how can we think of ways that we need to be sort of amenable to broader sets of outcomes, ways that our infrastructure at a particular location may be vulnerable to climate changes in other regions, for example? How can we build in some of that kind of thinking as we're thinking locally about resilience for our assets, I think is going to be an emerging area going forward. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about how small shifts in average conditions can lead to large changes in extremes. First, a little bit of the sort of background context. We're going to be talking about projections from climate models, so I want to tell you a little bit about climate models and how they work, perhaps a bit different lens than what we usually hear. What you're seeing in this plot, probably difficult for me to point there. Okay, so if folks look, if you can make out that, so you're seeing temperatures on the y-axis and basically history 1900 to 2000 on the x-axis. The black line is global average temperature, smoothed to account for sort of year-to-year variability. You can see the strong upward trend since about the 1960s or so, roughly 1 degree of warming. That's probably a familiar chart to a lot of folks. What I want to highlight on is these two bands of color that you can see here. Let's first talk about that sort of light green band. That's showing you the results that you get when you use climate models. Not projections out into the future, but running climate models over a historical period. Starting a climate model from the year 1910, when the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere were about 30% lower than what they are today. And then running a bunch of climate models forward 100 years, but keeping the greenhouse gas concentrations right where they were in 1910. That produces the green band you can see. That band also includes things like volcanic eruptions, sunspot variability, some of the common things we talk about for explaining the low levels of natural variability in the system. So that's a whole bunch of climate models. There's a band that you can see in light green that reflects the fact that climate models differ. There's variability depending on the model. Now let's look at that other band, the dark blue shading. That's the identical climate models. Started in the same way in 1910. The difference there is each year as we moved out from 1910, the greenhouse gases in the model, driving the model, increased to match what we actually put into the planet's atmosphere over those 100 years. That's the blue band. And what you can see is, with only a few exceptions, that blue band, first of all, the range in the blue band is larger than for the green. That's because climate models differ in how much warming they want to produce as we put more greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. There's uncertainty. From a risk management perspective, you get a broader band as you push that system a little bit. The key point, though, is how rarely the black line of observations departs from the blue band of those models. The point here is if we want to move towards the future with a risk management approach, testing these two hypotheses, the one that includes greenhouse gases as we move to the future, demonstrates how the statistics have already shifted for global average temperature. If we assumed, based on the climate of the past, our infrastructure and all our key decisions would perform poorly. So that's a key part of the foundation for climate models. We use them to test different hypotheses. We can look at how volcanoes change. It's when we put in the greenhouse gases and that natural variability that we're best able to reproduce what we've actually observed. Not just for temperature, but for this whole set of other climate variables depicted here that we also see changing dramatically. Upper ocean temperatures, the amount of humidity in the atmosphere, the changes in the ice sitting on land, changes in Arctic sea ice. All these components of the climate system changing and changing dramatically. Okay, now let's shift back to average temperature. We showed in that earlier plot how we've had about 1 degree of warming, Fahrenheit, slightly more than that over the last 50 or 100 years. How does that look when we look place by place on the globe instead of averaging across the entire surface of the planet? What you can see here, a lot of regions where we've had 4 degrees Fahrenheit of warming since 1900 depicted in the purple. White areas here are just areas where there's not enough data, especially in the first half of the 20th century, to show a trend. There's only a couple spots on the whole planet where you see a negative trend. That's the light blue over the North Atlantic and a little bit of the southeastern U.S. Those decreases in temperature are a full order of magnitude smaller than the warming that I mentioned, the 4 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. Where there's been cooling, it's been about half a degree or so. So risk management, the statistics have already shifted at the global average, but even more so if we start to look place by place and at the shorter timescales that are so key for our infrastructure. So here's sort of takeaway point number one from the talk. Small shift in average temperature means much more frequent extremes and much more extreme extremes. Probability of occurrence, frequency is on the y-axis here. We have a distribution of temperatures on the x-axis. Extremely cold days are very rare. Extremely hot days are very rare. It's common to get days that are 50, 60, 70 degrees Fahrenheit. As we shift temperatures just a little bit, the frequency of 60-degree days hardly changes at all, but the frequency of 100-degree days may double or triple. And we start to experience these 105-degree days that are much more severe in their impacts than, say, 102-degree days. We see nonlinear impacts on human health at those really high temperatures. We see nonlinear increases in building energy demand with a couple degrees more of warming. We're highly sensitive out at those tails. So that's just a schematic. Let's look at some actual data averaged across 1,800 weather stations across the U.S. We've had 1 degree of warming across the U.S. Already we've seen, when we look at the ratio of across these 1,800 stations, how often you're having a record-breaking hot extreme versus a record-breaking cold extreme for a given calendar day. Most of the last 60 years, this is decade by decade, it's been a roughly 1-to-1 ratio. Once we got to the 2000s, suddenly more than twice as many record-breaking hot as record-breaking cold events. This has continued into the 2010s. So with 1 degree of warming, which sounds like nothing, we've already seen the statistics shift profoundly for extremes. And of course, we expect larger changes in the future. Now let's talk about sea level rise. I hope people can see the figure on your right. That's the one to hone in on here. This is showing you what happens to the frequency of extreme coastal flood events with 2 feet of sea level rise. 2 feet of sea level rise is a conservative low-end projection for later this century. We'll be lucky if we only get 2 feet of sea level rise. And this assumes that storms don't change at all. We're not invoking stronger hurricanes or stronger nor'easters. If you just raise the baseline, if you raise the floor by 2 feet, what the figure on the right is showing you is how often you're going to get these high water levels that historically have happened once every 100 years. And what you can see there is that for large parts of the U.S. coastline, hone in on the red over Southern California and a little bit of the Gulf Coast there. Those are places where every year on average, with just 2 feet of sea level rise, you're going to be experiencing that high water level that in the past has only happened once every 100 years. And every single spot, even the places that are more optimistic, some of those greens, every one of those places within the lifetime of a typical residential mortgage, 30 years, is going to be experiencing a high water level that in the past only happened once every 100 years. 2 feet of sea level rise, no invoking of stronger storms. That's what we faced with small shifts in average conditions. That's what it means for the extremes that impact us. It's not just the really rare events, though. This is the frequency of nuisance flooding, right? These are these sort of subtle events associated with regular tidal cycles that make it hard to drive home from work, put a few inches of water in people's businesses or their basements. If these things are happening a couple times a year, maybe we can manage them. But what you're seeing here with the yellow is over the past 40 or 50 years, just how much more common those events have become. I show Charleston and San Francisco here, but you can see this anywhere in the U.S. And around the globe. 5-fold increase, maybe a 10-fold increase already in Charleston and how often they're having those types of events. At what point does this become something that's not a nuisance anymore, but something that starts to be sort of built into what everybody expects? And at what point do you start to see decisions being affected when this isn't seen anymore as just sort of a random act, but something where people take in the fact that these statistics have already shifted. Colored bands show you, different projections out into the future. Again, highlighting that even if we sort of get lucky on sea level rise, some of the blue or green scenarios with a little bit of sea level rise, even there, far more frequent nuisance flooding. In some cases, getting where it's happening pretty much every other day. That's in an optimistic scenario. Okay, now in my last few minutes, I said that I want to talk a little bit about some of the surprises. What if everything isn't? That was actually the optimistic scenario from a climate perspective. There's a lot of reason to be optimistic from an adaptation and a resilience perspective. I know we're going to talk a lot about that today. But purely from a climate perspective, those are major challenges that we're locked into. Other things that could happen are depicted here. Heavy rain events. So what we've observed over the northeast U.S. is that these sort of 1% of days where we have the most rainfall are becoming 50% or more common than they were, say, 50 years or so ago. Again, just with 1 degree of warming. And that's actually a much faster increase in the really heavy rain events than climate models told us to expect. This is something that's happening faster than what climate models or sort of the basic theory of shifting averages that I've been talking about would suggest. This is happening faster than we thought, obviously posing a major challenge for our infrastructure. When we start thinking about the effects of hurricanes, we should also think that we expect much heavier rainfall during those storms. And with that higher sea level, even if the strength of the winds, the strength of the low pressure doesn't become larger than in the past, we're going to have more flooding with higher sea levels, heavier rain events, more of a challenge as we think about how to clear all that kind of water. Okay, so I was talking about a 2 foot of sea level rise scenario. Our work with the New York City Panel on Climate Change here in New York, we've been advocating for considering about 6 feet of sea level rise as a worst case scenario. If you're thinking about your sort of can't fail infrastructure for 100 years, we've been advocating those numbers for over a decade now. The science has come along to where sort of at the US scale and beyond, you've seen catching up here. Again, it's not that 6 feet is the most likely. It's that if you want to protect the Indian points, the sort of can't fail infrastructure, maybe you want to think about these plausible worst case scenarios, which clearly are maybe 6 feet, 8 feet by 2100 as things that we can't rule out, even as 3 feet is perhaps a more likely outcome by 2100 or so. And again, this is something where the climate models can't tell us all we need to know because they can't capture these fine scale processes that are happening over the ice sheets as the ice sheets become undermined in ways at fine spatial scales that climate models can't capture and start to move and disgorge their ice into the oceans where they raise sea level. Over the oceans, we're observing not just warming of temperatures, acidification, but also changes in the amount of oxygen in upper levels of the ocean. That's an example of the kind of thing that's going to have impacts on food chains. Hard to say exactly what that's going to mean for our sort of built environment, but it would be dangerous to assume that it's just sort of peripheral and not something we should think about. We need to think about climate impacts in other regions, and we got to think about some of the cascading effects of some of these impacts that may be a little outside of what we think about on a daily basis. And all this, of course, argues for the need to dramatically reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as we're simultaneously thinking about adaptation. I think a lot of folks are probably familiar with the carbon countdown. This is the idea that if we want to avert some of these most extreme impacts, if we don't want to exceed 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, for example, if we want to have a 67% chance of not blowing through that 2 degrees Celsius target, we really have less than 20 years now depicted in the sort of purple band, the thickest of those purple bands moving like a clock, clockwise there. We have under 20 years that we can keep emitting globally at the levels that we've been emitting in recent years. After those 17 years or so, we'd have to immediately go to zero. That shows the challenge that we face. So the point I've been trying to make in the second part of this topic is even as we know that the risk of extremes is going to increase very dramatically, we're also more and more concerned about the potential for surprises due to feedbacks in the climate system. If Arctic sea ice is melting faster than climate models thought it would, which is indeed the case, that means sunlight, instead of reflecting off that ice, is getting absorbed in the ocean, causing more warming, possibly changing atmospheric circulation, for example, in ways that are very hard to quantify, but from a risk management perspective, can't be ruled out. And the balance of evidence suggests, including we look at long-term historical data, relationships between temperature and sea level in the past, that climate models are probably underestimating rather than overestimating a lot of these risks. So again, there was a lot I know that was sort of pessimistic in there, but the same talk about tipping points, I think we need to think about in our social systems as well. And I do think there's reason for optimism in that regard. As I'm sure we'll hear more about sort of pressure to disclose, not just emissions, but also vulnerabilities, exposure and a risk perspective across groups. I do think there's the potential for that to sort of kick in as we think about funding agencies, bond underwriters, really sort of insisting discussion of climate risk. I do think that can change the dialogue very dramatically. We look at how the price of renewables has been dropping so dramatically. Batteries and electric utility vehicles, not quite there at the price point yet, but clearly if you look at how rapidly prices are changing, it's clear how things are moving, and tons of innovation in the adaptation space are the type that I know we're going to hear more about today. So I'll leave it at that with a reminder to folks that you can find very specific climate projections in that climate science special report and other data sources that I'd be happy to share. Thank you.
Michael, will these be available on the website?
Yeah, if the speakers give us permission to post these slides, we will post them online. You need to ask for that. Now that we've heard about what we need to be resilient to, we're going to hear from three speakers who are involved in designing and building resilient projects and sustainable projects. And the first of them is Pippa Brashear, who is the Director of Planning and Resilience at Scape, a landscape architecture firm in New York City. She works with planning, engineering, and design teams to integrate landscape strategies that are sustainable and resilient and that balance environment, infrastructure development, and community quality of life tools. And you'll hear about some of the projects she's involved in.
Hello. I think that works. Can people hear me? I'm a little shorter.
Yeah, it's on.
All right. So as Michael said, I work at Scape, Landscape Architecture. I'm a landscape architect and planner. This is us in our New York City office. We're about a 30-person firm, and a lot of the work we do is really aimed at how can we make regenerative landscapes that create resilience, but also new and ecologies and new forms of public space. And I think what I've tried to think about in the projects that I'm going to talk about here are why is design and design thinking relevant to what you guys might do, and to tell you why what you do in the law is kind of relevant in some of the resilience work that we're doing in design. What do landscape architects do, or what do we at Scape do in this realm? We do vision plans and vision designs. The project on the right above is a plan that we've worked on with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy here in New York City in the Gowanus Canal. If any of you are familiar, this is one of our Superfund sites, one of our local Superfund sites, but it's also a sort of growing and changing neighborhood. And how do we think about the landscape framework? It's also a neighborhood at risk of flooding, as well as a lot of economic and social pressures as well. And how do we think about a landscape framework, an ecological and infrastructural framework that can allow these to change? On the right is a resilience park in Norfolk, Virginia, where as part of a larger infrastructure project to do flood protection and stormwater management, there's this opportunity to introduce public space. And so this idea of multi-purpose infrastructure, and that's actually going into design, because in the end, these aren't just drawings on paper. The projects need to be built, and they're getting built in urban environments, in more natural environments, and all of these places, all of these types of places are subject to climate change, but they're also all places that people need to inhabit and exist into the future. And sometimes I think it's how we live in the landscape that needs to adapt, but the landscape itself is adapting, right? Many of even whether we're talking about plant selection with changing climate and heat and what that'll do to our urban green spaces, or whether we're talking about the capacity for natural ecosystems like beaches or marshes to contribute to our overall resilience. These are all things that we're thinking of as we're trying to design projects into the future. And I put these in to say that we're also building projects. It's also thinking about, how you get these things done in the environment. Whether we're talking about pro bono pilot projects where we're testing new materials, it's the one with people dropping these fuzzy ropes off of piers, or high-end plazas in Lower Manhattan that we've had to think about how in this dense environment they're going to manage massive amounts of stormwater and sometimes coastal events. So resilience is a theme it's not just about resilient projects, but what that means to everything that we do in design and construction. That said, I was, putting together a list of recent projects. Resilience is popping up more frequently in what we're asked to do. There are projects that are specifically aimed at planning and designing for resilience. And I think here in New York City, we've seen a pretty strong uptick in that since Sandy. So as an office, we've been involved in the New York City Strategic Initiative for Rebuilding and Resilience, the Rebuild by Design competition that I'll talk about later, the New York Rising Community Reconstruction Program, that was the state's kind of response, and the National Disaster Resilience Competition, which was the federal response. We're working on a number of projects related to that. And I think everybody sees these events and these competitions, but I think the thing for us to think about here today is those light blue bands that extend. All of these projects are still going on and needing to navigate the rules and regulations in this changing climate, which, as was highlighted earlier, is highly uncertain. So I'm going to focus on two projects to kind of talk about this process of navigating this environment, but also how we as designers tend to think about it. And I do want to say that these are both coastal projects and really focus on issues of sea level rise, coastal flooding, but this is one piece of the puzzle. And I think it's helpful to kind of focus, but this could be applied to heat, rising temperatures and the pressures that they pose and increased precipitation. So Rebuild by Design was a design competitions run by the National Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and supported by the Rockefeller Foundation. And I think that this quote from Hank Ovink, who ran Rebuild by Design, who was brought on by then Secretary Donovan to run this process, kind of sums it up. That these were design-led but interdisciplinary teams. SCAPE led a team, but our team consisted of hydrodynamic modelers, Phil Orton from the Stevens Institute, engineers, COE Engineering, ecologists, Sea Arc, marine consulting, nonprofits, the Billion Oyster Project here in New York City, Paul Greenberg, an author who helped us craft these messages, and I'm sure that I am forgetting some people who were on the team. But it was a really big collaborative team that allowed us to think about these things and think about how this whole idea of a competition and thinking design first was a different way of thinking than others. And so the competition itself was actually in a number of phases. The first was we were not given sites and problems to solve, but rather asked to think regionally about the region. And I think this is important when we're trying to think about how we adapt and innovate. And so a lot of people were making maps of the risks after Sandy, and this is one that we did. There were a lot of human and ecological as well as economic impacts, and I think that was the focus. We saw a lot of red maps and things getting worse. But I think one of the things that we often forgot in the wake of Sandy that was all of what the harbor means, both culturally and personally to people in New York, but also economically. It's if not New York Harbor, then not New York City or the region. Part of the reason that we are here was its rich quality as an estuary and the fisheries it provided, and now ports and transportation. We kind of went into this competition saying we can't turn our back on the harbor. What if we can't build a wall? What if we have to think about not eliminating risk, because there are uncertainties. We never are going to know how high to build that wall, but also we can't live with it. But rather step down risk and try to find something that avoided catastrophic failure. but also tapped into the diverse coastal typologies of the region, the ecological conditions, which you kind of dubbed the shallows, the edge, this expanded shoreline, as well as the communities that lived upon it. So we came up with this framework that resilience needs to encompass not only risk reduction, I think we often use that term to focus really just on the hazards, but what that means for the ecosystems and the culture as well. And so ultimately, we proposed a number of different projects. The one that was selected by HUD and which we were asked to develop was called the Living Breakwaters Project. And this, for those of you who are not familiar with New York, is literally the southern tip of New York. The point you see here is the southernmost tip of Staten Island. And this project was a string of offshore breakwaters to protect this area from coastal flooding, specifically wave action and erosion, because it's positioned at the New York Bight, and I should have had a picture of the harbor. This area was really heavily hit and damaged by waves. And so breakwaters, it's not a really complicated technology. They break waves and will knock down those waves in storm events. And that's important because it's one thing to have 3 feet of water in your living room. Inundation is good, but having your house knocked off its foundation is another story. And so this was something that happened over there. The other issue is shoreline erosion. With rising sea levels, but even before that, we're seeing erosion of some of our beaches as we've lost natural habitat. And so how can structures like this control and build back the shoreline? But we were also interested in how they may reconstruct and create sort of new hybrid infrastructure that provided habitat, much like the historic reefs that used to exist there. And then to foster social resilience through the visual presence of these, the reefs that they provided, the widened beach, but also improving access to that beach, raising awareness of risk, while actually reducing it. So increasing perception of risk while reducing risk itself, and encouraging stewardship. So people thought we had a good idea because the federal government awarded the state funding to implement this, and it is now being implemented by the New York State Governor's Office of Storm Recovery. And this is the second quote from Hank that I wanted to put up, and I think what I want to kind of focus here with this group today is that these are great ideas and they're out there, but we have to figure out how to implement them. And that is what we've been engaged in for the last 4 years. So the design competition lasted about a year, but we are wrapping up the end of the environmental review process on the project itself right now. And that's 4 years later. And as lawyers, I'm sure you know everything that goes into an environmental review process. You can understand why that took so long. But part of this has been evolving the design, which you can see the 2 on the right. It's been refined through engineering because these are the types of drawings that we're working on and making now. But as I alluded to, it's been a close working relationship with the engineers, but it's also been navigating this and understanding how a new type of infrastructure fits into, these list of regulations. And, this is page 1 of 4. This is a matrix that we made at the outset of all of the things we thought we had to navigate. And like I said, this is, where we are. So existing in this sense, I think how we define these new ways of adapting to resilience and how we start to talk about these processes in a climate that is inherently uncertain, where we absolutely cannot know what is going to happen specifically. So a couple lessons that we've learned in how this process works is communication and collaboration. And for us, that is that interdisciplinary nature within the project team. It's how we communicate with the public or publics, because it's not one. And I think that's really important, that public engagement process, which is often viewed as mandatory, becomes a real dialogue because people are really nervous about what's happening in this rate of change. But it's also communicating with regulators. And as a designer who's not a policymaker and not a lawyer, this idea of language and communicating across and how we need to communicate the ideas in policy language or stakeholder language or in the language of the laws and regulations has been really a learning lesson for me. The other thing is, if we are talking about areas of uncertainty and of new techniques, the importance of exploration and iteration. So in principle, we know that breakwaters function to protect, to sort of build beach in the shoreline. This is a video, so it should work. But what we've seen in, so this is the site, and just to emphasize this issue of erosion, which I think isn't always visible unless you start to really look at places over time, is that since 1978, everything you see that is red is erosion. It's lost feet of shoreline. So the sort of the largest end you see there is about 3 feet a year. Much of the other red is about 1 foot a year. And so one of our questions was, how do we reverse that? And there was the diagram of how to stop waves was pretty simple, but the complex dynamics in the coastal environment, and I think you'll see these complexities, as was Bradley alluded to, with whether you're talking about temperature change or precipitation, that you're not sure how when you put something in the environment it's going to change it. So we did a series of iterative models with these shoreline, with computer models, numerical models, with our engineering partners, Arcadis, to understand how different alignments of the breakwaters might interact with shoreline change. And the first 3 that we did were these sort of simple diagrams to get the principles. And then I'll let it run one more. You'll see a couple of different scenarios ultimately, and we'll get to the end. But ultimately we did almost 19 or 20. So in addition to that computer modeling, I think the experimentation and validation of materials as we're using them has been important. So this is a diagram of what one of those breakwaters look like. And they are really largely of rock, but we're incorporating new materials, bioenhancing concrete called e-concrete. And what was helpful for us was that the ecologists who had worked on this had done studies, they'd done published papers, they tested these and piloted them and could bring that to the project. But we also still needed to know how they worked in the environment. So we did physical modeling. This is literally, you can see a person in there to scale, a 1 to 20 scale model of the breakwaters that sat in a wave tank. This was at the National Research Council in Canada, and ran waves at different overtopping scenarios to prove that this new technique was going to be structurally stable. So I think that type of proof needs to be built into the process as we design for new and changing conditions. The other element of this project that was really important was building habitat. This is sort of a rendering of what that underwater habitat would look like. They combined use of those bioenhancing concrete, those e-concrete units that I talked about, but also this concept of the reef street that mimicked reef-like habitats. And so this is looking at that physical model, what some of those features look like. But part of that was understanding how and where to place these different treatments that might enhance habitat, and integrating them into the design in the right way that when we went back and monitored, we could actually learn from that and adaptively manage in the future the project. It's also been incorporated into the larger layout to have controls and breakwaters with treatment, so we'll know and we can learn both to adaptively manage that project, but also look at how some of those techniques might be replicable to other places. And I think that that's really important for all the work that we do in climate change, because we're all learning from what others do. So really briefly, and I went a little longer than I meant on that, so this really applies to all scales and all contexts. And I want to touch briefly on a totally different scale and type of project that we're working on in Red Hook, New York. So this is a waterfront development site. You can kind of see where it is relative to Manhattan in this rendering, and the developers and the architects are in charge of the building, and we're really working on that edge on what we call the Shore Public Walkway in New York. This area was wildly inundated during Sandy and has projections, and just to illustrate with sea level rise, what we're talking about is these are the kind of elevations of flooding on what the site looks like today. So when you put in all of the building codes and zoning codes, you end up with something that, to get the 100-year storm, is 15 feet above the current water level. But we want people to actually be able to get to the water. That needs to be a usable space. And so we look at different conditions, right? And there may be a desired condition, but each one of those conditions require additional work like certification, varying from the status quo, certification with the New York City Department of City Planning to bend those rules, or even compensatory mitigation if it requires fill from New York State DEC. And so the impact of that on design is that while all those ideas are out there, it's very hard as a designer in the design community to add time or money to a project. And so you'll see that we really build a lot of bulkheads, but that's not always the case. And so trying to navigate that and create an environment where you achieve that height and prevention of flooding, but still retain that connection to the water and possibly even work in ecosystems is really important. And so how do we get to a place like this? It takes a lot of careful design, but also engineering, and we work with Langen engineers, so I think someone's here today, to figure out how to navigate this technically. But maybe raise a question for the next panel, how do we navigate that with the regulators? This is new territory of as the land and the edge changes with sea level rise. So some of the questions we asked are, can intertidal planting be included as part of that planting zone? Can places that are partially inundated be counted as part of the shore public walkway? These are questions that we have to tackle if we want to get really new and innovative spaces on the waterfront that allow for buildings navigating that climate change, but also providing access to the water and the type of quality of life on the waterfront that we're looking at. So two very different types of projects, but I think this way of thinking and approaching how we think about resilience from all perspectives is really important. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Beth Heider, who is Chief Sustainability Officer of Skanska USA. She supports Skanska's U.S. business units, building and civil construction, and commercial and infrastructure development with a combined annual revenue stream of about $7 billion. Her work focuses on the nexus of design, sustainability, and good business.
Thank you. So resilience is a journey. We're certainly not there yet. We've barely begun. So please think of this presentation like a toddler's first step. I'd first like to put resilience into the context of Skanska's commitment to sustainability. Then I'd like to share a little bit about how we are building resilience into our projects and the lessons we've learned doing so. And then finally, I'd like to outline what it means to plan for resilience. Let's see, here we go. Skanska is committed to delivering resilient solutions. In fact, through the International Chamber of Commerce, Skanska's global CEO made the global commitment at COP23. And on behalf of Skanska USA, I signed the We Are Still In commitment. How many of you guys are familiar with that? We are still in? Good, yeah. Did Columbia sign that? Do you know?
I think so. Yes.
So many, thank you, Radley, you would know. Yeah. Many universities, businesses, states, and community leaders signed this agreement essentially saying that regardless of what the federal government is doing, sorry, Kevin, that we are still in. We are going to support COP23. This is baked into our green building strategy, which I like to refer to as our green business strategy, and it's part of our larger commitment to sustainability. But okay, don't tell me what don't have me tell you what we're committed to. Ask me to show you what we've already done. Here are a few Skanska projects that actively addressed resilience and a few business lessons that we learned. And again, we're doing this not just because it's the smart thing to do. but because it's really smarter business. So do you guys remember where you were the night the lights went out when Sandy hit? I think that most of us can reflect on that. And if you were below the blackout zone, you were really out of luck. Unless you were in a building that was part of NYU's microgrid, that's the area that is lit that's just south of the blackout zone. And that area is served by a cogen plant that Skanska built deep below Washington Square Park. The intent originally was simply to reduce energy costs, but housing it in a watertight vault proved to make NYU's operations more resilient. So it was an investment from a lot of different perspectives. So here are some lessons that we've learned. Lesson number 1, never waste a crisis. During Sandy, New York Harbor rose to record level, and the surge in Lower Manhattan's Battery Park topped 13 feet. In less than a minute, Sandy's force completely filled our newly constructed NYU Langone Medical Center's 25-foot cellar with water. That evening, NYU lost its emergency generators in this building. And for a year prior to Sandy, Skanska, working with our architectural team members and BBJ, had worked to triple the size of the emergency department with a phased schedule of 30 months. Phased schedules aren't always the fastest way to deliver, but it allowed them to maintain their operations during construction. So when Sandy flooded the emergency department and a large part of the hospital, we had to act fast to devise a plan to get the ED operational. And so we were required to demolish all the work that we had already put in place and rethink the program to meet the new FEMA standards and New York City's building codes. Together, the team with the owners, with NYU, took a design-build approach to the rebuild. And the architects designed real-time throughout construction, and we were able to cut the construction time frame from 30 months to 12 months. The project was successful because everybody worked together. And I think here the business model really, really mattered. And I think it's also a good place to note here that the attorney who was Skanska's in-house general counsel at the time we did this work is now Skanska's CEO of all U.S. operations. Maybe there's a lesson there too. Lesson number 2. Don't make the same mistake twice. The key driver in design and construction of University Medical Center in New Orleans was to avoid repeating the problems that occurred during and after Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and to restore the region's healthcare capacity that it destroyed. UMC is a regional disaster response center, and it was designed to meet flood-resistant construction standards. The first floor, which houses all the critical functions, was now built 22 feet above sea level, which is well above the 5-foot floodplain. And stormproofing strategies were used in a really robust emergency backup power system, a structure that was designed to resist Category 3 hurricanes as well as tornadoes. And I think this is also notable. Also, nuclear, biological accidents, earthquakes, physical attacks, fires, pick a disaster. There were lots of inputs into the design of this facility. And all of this resistance is built in to an operation that can continue for over a week with virtually no outside support or backup supplies. Lesson number 3, restore commerce. When Sandy hit, the Rockaway boardwalks were decimated. That's the slide to the left. On the right, we elevated the new boardwalk above the 100-year floodplain, and it's now designed to withstand storms. And it was developed, and this is the important business case, it was performed here in 3 phases so that we could restore access more quickly and restore commerce. Collectively, the work that was done here will, in the future, better mitigate the risk of storm events, but it will also help the entire business community. Then almost exactly 5 years later, a variation of the Rockaway theme, restore operations as rapidly as possible, our Houston team successfully reopened our West Memorial Phase 1 and 2 office development, which sustained really significant damage during Hurricane Harvey. This project made headlines in the local news because it was the first project to come back online after the flooding. And this was thanks to really careful pre-planning and also marshaling a workforce of over 150 folks who we had ready to deploy the minute that we had access to the building. Lesson number 4, the past is no prediction of the future. This is what the jet bridges at LaGuardia Airport looked like on October 30th, 2012. We're currently in the process, Skanska with LaGuardia Gateway Partners, of building the new Central Terminal B. So for all of you guys who've had to experience the hate and discontent of the LaGuardia renovation, I'm here to tell you that there's good news. The parking garage is now operational, and we're actually going to be able to deliver that building 4 years earlier than was originally planned. In the new building, we've elevated the jet bridges as high as possible while still being able to connect into the adjacent abutments, and that will protect the new building against storm surge. We need to really pay attention to these strategies on LaGuardia because this is a P3 design, build, operate procurement, and we will operate the building for 35 years. So we have a real dog in this fight. I would encourage you to consider the kind of resilient analytics that Radley was alluding to when you investigate or when you invest in projects and not rely on antiquated floodplain data. When you think about it, Houston, our last example, has had 3 500-year storm events in the last decade. And to put that into context, the Pilgrims weren't even here 500 years ago. So it's happening fast. Lesson number 5. Resilient buildings really are part of the solution. The Brock Center was built for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to be resilient. It produces nearly twice the energy it uses. It's weathered storm surges that have completely flooded its site. It processes all of its waste on site, and it collects and purifies more water than is necessary to serve the demand. One of the interesting things about this project, and I think, again, it is really evocative of some of the comments that Pippa made, is that a lot of regulation has been created over time to prevent last year's or last decade's bad things from happening again. So regulation is created to prevent bad from happening, but it is not created to encourage good to happen. So at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, at the Brock Center, the design team worked really closely with the Commonwealth of Virginia's health department, and they were able to ultimately certify this building so that it is a potable water purification plant. The building is a plant. And even though all buildings that pursue living building certification, which is the little image there in the corner, which means that the building produces more energy, purifies more water, has no nasty chemicals in it. It's about as deep green a project as you can build. It requires that you be able to have potable water. This is the first project where the water was actually approved to be consumed. And what happens when you produce more water than you actually need? Well, you can cart it off-site to a local brewery, and for the 50th anniversary of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, they used the water purified on-site to create this Pilsner rain barrel Bohemian brew. What was interesting about this story, I think, also is that storytelling is really important to embolden the market and move them forward. And as extraordinary as it was that this is the first building in the U.S. where you could actually drink the water purified on site, API did not pick it up until they started brewing beer. Okay, so for LaGuardia and Brock, resilience was proactively considered as part of the design discussion. These are some of the rating systems and organizations that inform our work, and all of them touch on some aspect of resilience. The newest addition to the ecosystem of frameworks certified by the Green Business Certification Institute, RELY, is a comprehensive response to this urgent need for resilience in design and planning. And resilience involves interactive social, economic, and environmental elements that respond to both acute short-term and systematic long-term topics. At the annual Greenbuild Conference, which is hosted by the U.S. Green Building Council, and it's one of the largest conflagrations of its type. They have like 20,000 attendees every year. Last year, USGBC brought together state lawmakers and experts to hear the stories of resilience and recovery and to uncover both lessons learned and new ideas for rebuilding in communities struck by recent disasters and storms. The roundtable discussion provided support to state lawmakers intent on helping their communities build back better, stronger, and more resilient, and lawmakers presented stories of recovery. And the work of this discussion was captured in a report which is available through USGBC. One of the most stunning discussions was between the Chief Resilience Officer of Puerto Rico and his counterpart in New Orleans. And I mean, reflect on this last fall. It was right after Puerto Rico had been smacked upside the head by Maria. In just 80 years, some 2,000 square miles of New Orleans coastal landscape has turned to open water, wiping places off maps, bringing the Gulf of Mexico to the back door of New Orleans, and posing a lethal threat to energy and shipping corridor vital to the nation's economy. And now it's just going to get worse and even quicker. Scientists now say that one of the greatest environmental and economic disasters in the nation's history is rushing toward a catastrophic conclusion over the next 50 years, and so far it's unabated and largely unnoticed. I'm going to skip over the next piece because I want to talk just briefly about some work that the state of New York is doing in response to a call for action. New York State, working with NYSERDA, is leveraging capital that would otherwise be used to merely fix up social housing projects. And it reuses that money, and this is brand new, by the way. They're just going to be receiving their proposals on the first tranche of this competition later this month. The afternoon panel that Brian will be on is going to talk a little bit about energy, but I also wanted to connect the importance of the social impact of energy performance with resilience. These buildings are going to be retrofit to net zero energy or near zero energy so that they're much better positioned to passively survive disasters like Sandy. And meanwhile, net zero energy buildings have a dual purpose because they create the gift that keeps on giving by lowering the monthly energy bills for those who can least afford them. And I'm going to finish with an old cartoon that I think has never been more relevant than today. For those of the few of you in the crowd, right, who don't believe Radley's observations earlier, what if climate change is a hoax and we end up with resilient communities, thriving businesses, and healthy children? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we will hear from Kevin Campshire, who's the Director of the Office of Federal High Performance Green Buildings at the U.S. General Services Administration. He created the framework by which GSA responds to the challenges of greenhouse gas emission restrictions, and he's also GSA's Senior Climate Adaptation Official and leads the agency in planning for climate change risks.
Thank you. Good. The simple way works. So I wanted to talk about the federal concerns, and also I think that everything I say applies to anybody who is in the long-term hold business. It probably, I haven't figured out, and we were talking just before the start of this session, how do you get long-term hold thinking into flip and turn development, and when does the value begin to show up? And the trouble is that the value doesn't show up on the first flip or the second flip. It only starts showing up on the fourth, fifth, and sixth flips of the building, and that's a long way for a developer and a developer's lenders to think. The people who are going to change the thinking, I think, are the insurance business and the reinsurance business. They are thinking about the asset over the life of the asset, regardless of when they insure it. Just a little footnote here, my wife is an insurance lawyer who went to Columbia. And so I have this odd little perspective about what's going on in insurance. And just one example, asbestos. Now that's something that we used to worry about in the 70s and the 80s when it was a new thing. The litigation on asbestos is a robust industry this very day. And they're still talking about insurance policies that were written in the 50s and 60s and who's covering what, because the liabilities are still there. That is long-term hold thinking that is coming about through the insurance and through the legal communities, and it has to infect what we're doing with regard to risk. From the government's perspective, and I should also say that GSA is a very interesting kind of organization because we're designed to operate as a business. We collect revenue, $11.5 billion last year. We charge our tenants rent. We generate profit, and we turn that profit over to a somewhat unwieldy board of directors of 535 people whom you elect periodically, and they decide what to do with it. It doesn't all go back into the buildings. That may shock you. But we have to deal with mission assurance. And for us, and the reason that I've stayed at GSA for such a long time, is that it's not just a business, but it's a business that has one fundamental difference from a lot of other businesses. We only exist to make the work of our tenants, the other parts of the federal government, more effective. And we do that in a variety of ways, but a lot of it has to do with providing buildings and workspaces that enable work and support work and improve the conditions that people are working. We have lots of different missions. We have really obvious people like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which needs to work all of the time. We have a lot of other places that are very, very critical. We don't do the military, but we're very closely aligned with what the military are thinking about resilience and long-term, and we have a pretty broad interagency group. I think I would be remiss if I didn't repeat what everybody has said on the panel before. None of this gets solved by small groups. It gets solved by large groups working together and huge amounts of communication. We build for the long term. When we look at our design criteria, we are talking about 100 years, generally speaking. Not always. We know that some places are going to shift, and if you look at these wonderful jewel box courthouses that we built during the Depression, a lot of them are in places where people have moved away, and we're looking for creative ideas about how to reuse them in different ways. But we're sort of getting around the idea that what we build is going to last, and it's going to need to last. That first building that was shown up there was built in 1917 and first occupied in 1917. It's an amazing building because when the electricity goes out, now that we've renovated it back to its original design, the windows open and close. And in Washington, D.C., On 170 days a year, all you need to do to heat or cool the building is to open the windows. And it's good for you. It was also originally designed for the cartographers of the Geological Survey, and it was designed before electric light was cheap. Electric light didn't become cheap until the invention of the fluorescent tube during World War II. And so they use natural light. And if you look at the building, it's very subtle, but it's 70% glass on the north and 30% glass on the south, and the east and the west varies between 40 and 50%. So it really took the idea that the natural environment was something that you coexisted with. It's got narrow section halls so that when you open the windows on the left and the right, or the east and the west, the breeze goes across through the transoms and cools the building. It was built without air conditioning, didn't have air conditioning in the building until the late 30s when they started painting the windows shut. And if you go there, it's a very fun tour, especially if I'm giving it, because I'm making all of these jokes about the silly things we did for the years. But you'll still see 50-year-old, literally 50-year-old window air conditioning units sitting there rotting the wood on these beautiful windows around them until we get the money to replace them in phase 2. But the building is durable. It was built to last, and it does last, and it's going to last probably for another 100 years. The operability is something we have to be concerned about, not just when things are working right and you have electricity, but when things don't work right. The whole idea of passive construction, how can you cohabitate with the climate without electricity, or with much reduced electricity? Because, I mean, you might be having a near zero building. You might be able to produce a little bit of renewable energy, but you have to use it in a very conservative way, because you're not going to blast through on a 105-degree day and have a 65-degree office inside and have that last. And before I get to the science, I just want to say also that this whole idea of risk is embedded in law as well. We operate under the Federal Financial Managers Integrity Act, which was passed in 1982, and it's the thing that makes us think legally about the risks that we face across our portfolio of buildings is there. And that is a huge motivation, because it underpins every expenditure of money. And the interesting thing about the federal government too is that, and from a legal construct, it's hard to get across sometimes. In the private sector, you can do anything you want in your business as long as it's not illegal. In the federal government, you can only do those things that are specifically authorized in statute. So even though it's a great idea, if we can't find a link to where Congress has said you can do it, it's off limits for us. So it's a slightly different way of thinking about the law that is very difficult, and sometimes in our contracting relationships with people, difficult to understand. And science is actionable. Radley talked about the special report. We use it daily in our decisions, and we use it locally, and it's actionable science. This is a document that is such an incredible treasure trove of information that can be used at the micro level, and it makes you make judgments. But what risk manager doesn't make judgments? It makes you think about what you're going to do. I have here a picture of the Internal Revenue Service, everybody's favorite federal agency, and this is in Washington, D.C., and you can see the flood of 2006. And I don't have the headline from the Washington Post the next day, and it just said, IRS building may be closed for up to a month, or as it turned out, 7 months. The amount of damage that water does when it's sitting around, I mean, forget the waves, forget all of that, magnificent stuff. When water is sitting around and it won't leave, it is profoundly destructive. People in New York knew this, that the water was salt water. This happened to be mostly fresh water. Just to give a sense of this is in the Federal Triangle. It's in about the lowest place in downtown Washington, D.C. As you look behind the building, it goes uphill all the way. All of the water runoff that didn't make it into the storm sewers was running down all of these streets and getting right here to Constitution Avenue, which, by the way, in the Pilgrim's Day was called Tiber Creek. And there's a beautiful 30-foot barrel vaulted storm sewer underneath there, built by the Corps of Engineers when the Corps of Engineers was actually on the commissioners that ran Washington, D.C. And a 30-foot barrel vault will take exactly the amount of water that fits in there. There are floods now that produce more water than will go through that system. The city of Washington, D.C. stormwater runoff is the largest single source of pollution in the entire Chesapeake estuary. And that's a big estuary. More than all of the farms in Maryland put together. More than all of the farms in Pennsylvania and Maryland put together. All of that fertilizer doesn't compare with the stormwater runoff from Washington, D.C., which is, by the way, partially exacerbated by the fact that the water runs through the stormwater system to the Blue Plains treatment plant, where in a flooding event, it washes all the raw sewage out of the plant and into the rivers and into the bay. So what did we do in a case like this? We don't have a lot of options. Beautiful building, built in the 1930s. Why was the IRS closed for 7 months? Well, guess what was in the basement? All the computer equipment, all of the switch gear. We had generators, and don't get me started on diesel generators, but we had diesel generators sitting on all four corners of the building for 7 months. And that wasn't to run the building, that was just to clean up the building. The footnote, diesel generators didn't work too well in New Orleans because the supply chain was disrupted and there was no more diesel. The only people and the only single hospital in New Orleans that continued to operate was the one sensible one that had a natural gas emergency generator, and the natural gas continued to go. We need to go much more towards that. It's not only a less polluting way, it's a much more reliable way of doing work there. This is the Moakley Courthouse in Boston, and you can see it on a nice sunny day. It's, as you can see, close to the water. And then you can look at it at a high tide. And this is just high tide. This isn't actually a flood. The difference in sea level rise in Washington, D.C. and Boston is significant. According to the report, it's different by a factor of 2. We are planning for 8 feet of sea level rise in Boston. That's our planning horizon for what we're going to do. So what do we do here? The building is there. It's part of the revitalization of a part of Boston. Nobody wants us to take the obvious option, which is to retreat. So we adapt, and we adapt in various different ways through either disaster management plans, for looking at this. When we were looking at the Federal Triangle with all of our partners in the different agencies there, which include the Departments of Justice and the National Archives, one of the things we discovered is this temporary solution. Let's just retreat and we can operate from other places. Most of the agencies didn't have a key component of the supply chain addressed in this plan, which was how do you get enough throughput on your electronic communications so that you can all of a sudden let 9,000 people start communicating solely electronically and not through in-person conversations. It's astounding to think about that, but you start doing that and you can grind an organization and an agency to halt. we're also in remote places, border stations, and Brian's going to talk about these, I hope, in his talk later. And here we're looking at floods and electrical distributions as our risk. Obviously, this is a little bit remote. We have big border stations, we have small border stations, but we need to keep them operational. It's a part of the security of our country, and it's also a part of what our commitment is to the Border Patrol there. Now you take a look at a different kind of station, the Otay Mesa port of entry, where we're rebuilding that in the near future, and we're giving instructions to the designers that we need to operate in passive conditions, in extreme heat, and also in flooding, because we're right here. You can see the water in the picture here, there, right near San Diego, in the border between San Diego and Tijuana, and this is one of those areas that were the really red dots in Southern California on Radley's map, and that's what we're dealing with here. So how do we do this? We do this by a series of passive reactions. We do this by mitigation. How do we make, we get a twofer on the mitigation. How do we make the buildings consume less energy, which then gives us the gift that keeps on giving us, Elizabeth said, and causes the operations to be less expensive, but also enables us to continue work with less there. We have a border crossing on the southern border that is almost 100% powered by renewable energy today. And again, it operates in extreme heat and during the night when you have to provide electric light for the safety of the people who are guarding the border as well. And we also do it by adaptation. How are we going to use the natural flows of water to help us keep the water out of where we don't want it to be, and that way there. And so it's both active and passive works. And what are we doing, for the long-term future risk, where we're looking at, this is the border crossing at Alexandria Bay. This is the largest single trucking business crossing in the world. And it's an extraordinary amount of traffic going across this bridge, across the St. Lawrence. You can see that we're up on a bluff. We don't have to worry too much about flooding. We have to worry about the availability of water. Chances are we'll be drilling wells and doing ground source heat pump exchanges here. You can do it in granite. People don't tend to think so. And what I learned when we were working on this project was granite's incredibly porous if you go down far enough and there's enough pressure. So that's what we're doing. We have resources at all of these sites. And yes, my slides are available, but the best resource is really that USGCRP report on climate change. Remember, if you remember only one thing, science is actionable, and if we don't take action, we're idiots.
Thank you so much. We now have some time for questions, and I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask. You don't want to look at yourself?
No, I don't want to look. I want to, yeah. No. There, that's better.
That'll work. I want to ask Beth and Pippa a question that is inspired by Kevin's remarks about long-termism as opposed to developers who flip. Have you found in your practices that you get different directions from clients depending on whether they expect to hold long-term or whether they think they're going to flip? Have you actually seen that happen?
Oh, yeah.
Can you?
Yeah, I would say we work on both, private and public, both private and public projects, and I think a lot of agencies that know they're going to be maintaining something over a long period of time are really looking at the highest of high ends of sea level rise projections, and very, very concerned about the long-term operation and maintenance of things over time. And many of our developer projects are much more concerned about, the impact on construction cost and that factor. And so I think, one thing we've been thinking about in our practice is how you lower the barriers of entry to sort of thinking about long-term change from whether it's regulatory or funding or financing perspective, because you do see that difference.
Yeah, truly. I mean, Skanska has a commercial development group, and our CD guys would shoot me if they heard me say that we're merchant developers, because they actually don't build sort of cheap and cheerful projects. They build projects that are intended for institutional investors. But our model is to develop the land, design the building, tenant the space, and then sell the property as a valuable asset. Fortunately for us, most of our investors are long-term investors, so they appreciate the value, the longer-term thinking that's built into the building. The tenants tend to benefit more than the owner, so there's this sort of split incentive challenge that we face in the way buildings are tenanted, and that I think is a challenge. We do a lot of work for hospitals, for universities, for other entities that are essentially institutional investors. And to Kevin's point, they tend to see the long term within the context of what their funding allocation is. But we can't. One of the challenges certainly that I face is that even though we judge ourselves based on green revenue, that's one of the markers that Skanska uses to take a look at how we're advancing the market, we don't have a lot of influence over what we build. We have influence over how we build, but not what we build. And so it's always a challenge to engage in a dialogue with a client around what is your horizon, and in particular, what is the return on investment. We do have those conversations, and we crunch numbers when we can engage in a discussion. So from a contract standpoint, we'd love to be brought on board early on when you can have really thoughtful discussions rather than at the end when you're just putting green sprinkles on top of the cupcake. That was kind of a wandering answer, but
very interesting. Questions?
Well, just to follow up on
There's a button in front of the microphone, I think.
Thank you. To follow up on your question and the two answers, would it make sense for municipalities to provide some form of incentive, either through direct financing or tax abatement or zoning bonuses, in order to encourage them for buildings that meet long-term but not necessarily short-term sustainability goals?
I think so, and I think you're seeing that in like building and zoning codes, particularly those that have done sort of climate adaptation or resilience. But it is a challenge because it's often very, what that mechanism is to trigger the right decision is often very site specific, both because the risks and challenges are different, but also because the existing regulatory and building code contexts are different. So yes, but it's a really challenge to sort of execute that. I also think it has building on something you said, a sort of financing aspect to it that, we similarly are brought on often late, but you're also often brought on as part of a capital project, and not many, whether they're companies or whether they're, actually companies probably have a better ability to do this, but definitely for public projects, it's hard to internalize the long-term benefit financially. So capital budgets and operation budgets are often totally separate, and it's not, more and more people are thinking about sort of life cycle costs, but it's still hard, I've found, on our individual projects. So.
But I think that you're touching on something that's important. There are things that don't have immediate costs, that municipalities, states, and the federal government can do that will influence people in sort of the broad panoply of businesses that are associated with it. So imagine, and there are so many things. For example, FEMA funds flood insurance, and the flood insurance is not paid for by the insurance premiums. Insurance commissioners can do things within states that would focus the insurance community on these long-term risks in a way that they would be evaluated and worked into the premium, so that we don't end up with these big bills after Sandy. And you can do things about, for example, in Boston, there's a series of scenarios, the science scenarios. And imagine if the city government said, this is our planning scenario for the city, and we're all planning for the 8-foot rise that GSA is planning for. It changes the way that everybody has to think within the business context. And the good thing about it coming from the states and the municipalities is it levels the playing field for all of the business who are competing for that. So all the developers then have the same scenario. So I think it's a really, really good point. And I think for the next panel, make sure you ask them about the evolution of attribution science. There's a report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that talks about the science of attribution, climate attribution. And there's also an emerging field in attribution law. And I think that is something that should play into it. And there's an interesting report that I forgot to put on my references that I'll add to it before it goes on the site about attribution law. And I think that's very important. Not very many people in the business know about it, but it's definitely new.
Just to chime in on that, this is maybe more of a question than a statement. Knowing a little bit about the attribution of the climate science side, in talking with lawyers, I'm sort of getting a sense of all the obstacles potentially to seeing claims of harm, or oil majors, for example, actually having to pay out, for example, on some of the damages, or potentially people who haven't protected against some of the risks or adapted having to pay out. But it seems like even if you accepted the premise that it might be hard to get payouts, there's reputational risk kind of questions. And this is a discussion that we're just going to see more and more of, because the science is so clear. The damages are so huge and just going to get huger. It may be that just like we could see property values, for example, start to crash in a lot of coastal areas long before the water arrives, maybe you could start to see this assumption that someone could be found liable, leading to more encouragement of greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation measures.
A lawyer could love this title. It's actually called Acts of God, Human Influence, and Litigation.
As a lawyer, I love the title. We're out of time. Let me just say that in the next panel, we'll hear a discussion about the liability of architects and engineers. I think the attribution science you're talking about is more about the liability of fossil fuel companies and greenhouse gas emitters. And on that, there are, I think the latest count is 10 lawsuits in the United States that are asserting that. Most in California, but one in New York and one in Colorado. None of them have been decided yet. We don't yet know. I'm not going to say the jury's out because these are jury cases, but none of them have been decided. So we don't know whether it really has legal feet, but we'll find out in the coming months and years. With that, we are out of time. I want to thank 4 terrific panelists. Thank you.